This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video is our ongoing video on the Psalms in our third installment. And this is not about Psalm 3, this is the third installment of our video on the Psalms. And remember that what we're doing in this video series is looking at some categories modern readers use to help us understand the Psalms. No one Psalm fits perfectly in these categories. It's just a helpful thing for us that when we look at a Psalm, what is the theology in it? Last time, the second video was about lament. And lament was the expression of complaint based off the promises of God leading to the experience of the present, which don't seem to fit with the promises of God, and then eventuating in God's faithfulness and then giving thanks. Well, these Psalms are just about thanksgiving, but we're gonna find out that many of them also have lament, that these two things are always looking at one another, that maybe in fact they are one subject with just two different headings. And we'll see why in just a couple of minutes. So first is to understand that giving thanks was not just something we do saying it's nice that we give thanks, but that it was a ritual. It was a todah ritual, which was a word for a prayer of thanks or a sacrifice or offering of thanks. And it's the same term, meaning it wasn't really about the sacrifice, it wasn't really about the offering, it was about the expression, but all of it is tied together. And that these psalms are tied to those, one would imagine they would have been sung at a sacrifice of thanks or a prayer of thanks, but that the language in them is incredibly personal. This was not necessarily true in a variety of the lament psalms, many of which were collective. There were personal ones as well, but they were collective. These, almost all of them, are personal, but as we'll discover, the personal ones turn out also to be communal. There's a few, such as, say, Psalm 68, that might actually be communal in its sense of all that God has done for the people of Israel, but most of them are going to be personal with a communal aspect in the background. So we'll be looking into that and how. Well, first is to see what is usually in a psalm of thanks. Well, it's not quite as simple as just saying, well, they say thank you. It's a little bit more going on. So first is an invitation to give thanks or an affirmation of your already having the intent of giving thanks. So, for example, invitation to give thanks. Give thanks to the Lord, for the Lord is good. It's an invitation. It's kind of a command, actually. Sometimes it can be translated, let us give thanks to the Lord, for the Lord is good. It's an invitation for all those present to do so. The other is an affirmation of intent. Like you might say, it is good to give thanks. Meaning you're already going to do it, but we're going to recognize and affirm what you're doing, that what this process is a valuable one for you and for God. The second piece, and this is a critical piece, is it narrates the distress from which I have been delivered or rescued. This is really important because this is what makes it more than just, well, we give thanks, but almost all the Psalms that give thanks to God are a something that they're giving thanks for. What's the reason we're giving thanks? Now, we talked about 2 videos ago, Psalms of Praise, and that we did describe the reasons for praise. And you could say, well, that's really similar. So maybe, because some of those reasons were not distress we'd been in, so maybe we could put those together. I'm fine with that. But understand that the way lament and thanksgiving are tied together is that there's distress from which I have been rescued. The lament's in there. And that distress wasn't just a bad thing happened, but that it was a bad thing that happened that should not have happened if my God is my God, what we saw in lament. And then you have been rescued, what was not there in lament. Lament was the hope for deliverance is where we get to the end. Here, we begin with we were delivered after something we couldn't believe we'd be delivered for. I think probably most notably, some of you know Psalm 40, where you've drew me up from out of the pit, from the slimy mire. There's amazing metaphors in Psalm 40 of there was no way out. I was in deep lament. There was no way out. And then you rescued me, which that is what leads to what we would usually assume is in a Thanksgiving song. A Thanksgiving God now. This was about the past. Now it's in the present. So now I'm giving thanks. And into the future. So, give thanks to the Lord forever in Psalm 30, for example. But this is a really interesting dynamic that you kind of need to go through these 3 steps to really give thanks. And that's what we call them Thanksgiving Psalms. Some of the Psalms of Praise had thanks, but that from lament, then God's faithfulness shows up, and we have an ability to give thanks in a much more deep and meaning-filled way than before. And remember, we've been talking a lot about Psalms trying to engage the whole body. Well, part of what the distress that I have experienced is a whole bodily distress. It's not just an intellectual exercise that this shouldn't have happened, but no, there was real suffering involved, and that it is doing something. It's good for me to do this, for me to go back through that, see where I've come, see where God has brought me, so now I can give thanks. And as we mentioned, this is usually tied to ritual. Well, of course, all worship is ritual, and just different kinds of ritual, and that in worship, we are recognizing who we are and who God is. That's my definition of worship. Well, the way we could do that is by seeing where I have been and where God has been with me that leads me to a new place. And my whole being experiences that. But then there's this dynamic, the personal and the communal. And the way those fit together is frequently in the end of this or within it, there's not just an invitation to the one to give thanks, but an invitation to others to join in thanks. This is really significant because these are other people. So John Collins calls them bystanders to join in giving thanks, meaning the distress wasn't theirs, but they're able to see the way God works in distress. And then that has a parallel to my own distress. And that it is a message of empathy that I can feel with you. That the distress you have gone through, I see, leads to a more robust, meaning-filled thanks. Well, that same thing is true for me as I am invited, even though I haven't been part of this. So sometimes language of, so shout for joy. And that this process of doing this together, it's taking us on a journey. Psalms take us on a journey. We've had that emphasis throughout here. And so the Psalms, we have our laments. And just like we may not be lamenting this, it's a parallel to our laments. We can give thanks and recognize there's times for this. And it also encourages a way of thinking about what I would call seasons. There's seasons of my life of lament, seasons of my life of thanksgiving, and both times we're talking about the same thing, the same distress, but from a different perspective of seeing the way of God's faithfulness despite human chaos. And that's a really important idea in all of the Hebrew Bible of God versus chaos. You see it already in Genesis 1 and 2 of it's not God really versus evil or God versus humans. If God is versus anything, it is the idea of disorder and absolutely nothing going on. But then the challenge of human perception. We can often see the chaos but can't see God. Or when we can see God, we can blind ourselves to the chaos. But that the Psalms are trying to say that it's not about humans' perception, it's about God's faithfulness, what we see one way or another. And the Psalms of Thanksgiving invite us to see that dynamic in real time, that we offer our prayers of thanksgivings, our sacrifice offerings of thanksgivings, because this is the way God has acted for us, and that action leads to our response. It's not about us working hard enough to thank God. It's about the gift we receive from God. In a New Testament expression, grace means gift. Grace comes down to us from God and actually responds itself back to God, downward and upward, if we think about it spatially in that manner. And so this is what many of the Psalms of Thanksgiving are doing, and I invite you to look at some of those, like Psalm 40, Psalm 68, or Psalm 30, and take a look at the way in which we can see in our own lives ways we can give thanks alongside the way in which the psalmists give thanks. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.